Hi, I'm Adam Shepherd,
And I'm Jane McCallion.
and you're listening to the IT Pro podcast, where this week we've got something a little bit different for you.
In our first ever two-part special, we're going to be talking about Silicon Valley CEOs. We'll dig into what makes them successful and look at some of the praiseworthy traits they display, as well as some of their less positive qualities, and what leaders can learn from their examples, both good and bad.
This week we're focusing on the good, and whatever you think of Silicon Valley, it's hard to deny its success. It's often hailed as the innovation capital of the world, it's produced multiple unicorns and a substantial chunk of the Fortune 500.
When looking at Silicon Valley, strong leadership is commonly cited as one of the defining factors in a company's success. But that can be said of almost any company. So, what is it about Silicon Valley CEOs in particular that makes them different to just a good business person?
Mm. Well, one of the factors, one of the X factors, as it were, that makes Silicon Valley CEOs such a unique breed is the environment in which they can, by necessity, have to start.
Mm,
Silicon Valley is a very tough environment. It's insanely competitive. The amount of companies that flame out in the early stages and, never get beyond the kind of initial, five guys in a garage startup stage is insanely high. So, right from the get go, you need to be prepared to deal with a huge amount of failure and
mhm,
rejection. You need to be able to really push a kind of core team through the rocky early stages of a startup, which is tough. It requires a lot of different skills. It requires a lot of plate spinning. It requires an insane ability to deal with stress,
mm,
and that's, I think, a huge factor in why Silicon Valley CEOs are so unique. It kind of, you have to be hard as a CEO. You have to be you have to have a real resolve
mm.
with regards to your leadership that I feel you don't necessarily have to in other kind of sectors, other kind of geographies, other environments, if you like.
It's got me feeling very kind of like biology here, like sort of they're little extremophiles hanging out. Some of them don't make it, others grow bigger. It's
Mm.
very kind of evolutionary.
Well, yeah, it
Um,
is. Silicon Valley is very Darwinian. It's survival of the fittest.
mm.
Not in terms of the companies, because God knows there's been some absolute disaster areas that have made it big in Silicon Valley. But in terms of the people, you you kind of have to have this edge as
Mm.
a leader to be able to cut it. When you look into the biggest successes of Silicon Valley in terms of the people and the executives and the leaders, it's all people who are relatively ruthless in terms of their relationships and their business dealings.
Mm.
It's people who have insane work ethics, usually. And we'll get onto this more in the second episode of this series, where we look at some of the perhaps less positive qualities of Silicon Valley leaders. But they're always, the common trope is first one in, last one out. They'll be working evenings and weekends, which, at the early stage of a company, kind of everyone has to do, because it's, five people and an enormous amount of work to be done. But that often continues throughout the lifespan of the company. They either don't have or have to lose the ability to switch off and disengage.
Sure, I mean, unless you're Larry Ellison when you're choosing between Keynote and watching a boats race, like when you've come that far, I think that like kind of that's your prerogative is to go and go and watch your boats race. But yes, I think in general you are right, and like you say, this is very much a double-edged sword. I wonder also, I'm sure you and indeed most of our listeners will have noticed that Silicon Valley is in fact in America.
Mm,
And whether that has an impact as well. For the life of me, I can't think where I read it, but there's something about kind of in the UK being a failed business person, perhaps having gone bankrupt is like it's super bad. It
mm.
is
It's considered a
shameful.
failure.
yes, it is a failure, it is shameful, whereas in the US, and especially in Silicon Valley, it's kinda like, "Oh, well, yeah, that's a shame, but, knock your dust yourself off rather, and off you go and try again." And there is more of a sense of like, there's less, yes, it's a failure, but there is less shame
Mm,
attached. And, kind of I wonder if that's part of it as well, that, yes, they will have got knocked back. Either, kind of their first or second business didn't succeed, or they were in a couple of businesses that didn't succeed, or, didn't grow that big. Um, but that, while it is all a bit, like you say, kind of Darwinian, that at the same time it's really like it's ruthless, but also is it perhaps less ruthless than it is over here?
I wouldn't say it's less ruthless. I'd say it's perhaps more forgiving in terms of second chances and
Mm.
indeed, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh chances in some cases. But that actually is another key part of the environment. Most Silicon Valley founders, by the time they hit success, have had several companies under their belt, several failed companies, crucially,
Mm.
all of which will have, given them experience and taught them lessons. We learn as humans by making mistakes, and when you're operating in Silicon Valley, making mistakes, often fatal mistakes for the companies involved, is just kind of part of the process, you know?
Mm.
And,
Mm.
the most successful apps in history, Instagram, for example, was previously completely different. And they burnt it to the ground and started from scratch and came up with Instagram, which, of course, is now hugely successful and was, the subject of one of the biggest acquisitions in history.
Mhm, mhm. I wonder also, like, in my mind, in some ways, there's 2 types of Silicon Valley CEO. There is the rather more rarefied, but probably what pops into people's head first, founder CEO,
Mm,
more frequently co-founder.
mm.
So that is, your Mark Zuckerbergs, your Steve Jobs,
Bill
your
Gates.
Bill Gates, Mark Benioff. It's those guys, like, kind of the big names. Um, Whereas I think that probably most of the companies, though, startups aside,
Mm,
are don't have founder CEOs. Intel, for example,
mm,
is now under Pat Gelsinger, who was formerly CEO of VMware, which he also did not found.
mm. Yeah, and the same is true of a lot of kind of Silicon Valley organizations when they get to a certain stage and a certain level.
Mm.
Usually, after they've gone public, it is recognized by usually, the board of directors and the collected shareholders that the founder has perhaps taken the company as far as they can, and the time has come to institute somebody with more proven business experience who can get them out of the kind of the early growth stage and start making some big kind of commercial deals and can start really bringing in the Benjamins.
I was gonna say, you are, of course, now making me think of Steve Jobs again,
Mm,
who that happened to. He went off and, started Next, and then was brought back.
absolutely, and it's the pattern that we've seen with Pat Gelsinger, as you mentioned,
Mhm.
formerly CEO of VMware. He was actually in the upper echelons of Intel before he joined VMware,
Yeah.
and kind of has been linked to the top job at Intel. A couple of times, has been in the running a couple of times. Intel went with kind of more business focused candidates, shall we
Mhm.
say, and uh, kind of they brought Gelsinger back now to put more of a focus on the engineering and kind of getting back to core values, as it were. And that's quite often actually what happens with Silicon Valley companies. The shareholders and the board go, okay, this, not always founder, as is the case with Gelsinger, but this technical person is not who we want in the top job. We want someone with more business experience who can put more of a focus on the operational side of things. Uh, so they bring that person in and they zhuzh up the business, but that only goes so far with Silicon Valley companies in particular, because it usually needs to be driven by technological development, because the rest of the industry moves at such a
Mm.
hugely rapid pace that if you're not fueling that, those business deals with constant iteration and constant development and constant, technological progress, your competitors are going to catch up and outstrip you. And there's only so much that business now can do to bring money in if there's no solid product innovation going on to support it.
Is it maybe kind of like a phase thing then that sometimes, or a lot of your time, the person you'll want at the top spot is a technical person, but every so often it just needs a shove from a business person. It kind of
Absolutely.
gets a bit too bogged down technically, or whatever, and it needs a person with a different perspective to come along and give it a shove.
Yes, absolutely. And this is why a lot of the most successful Silicon Valley CEOs have had a really strong team behind them, usually a really good second in command with an outstanding head for business. And this
Mm.
usually takes the form of a really solid chief operating officer. So, yeah, like with Steve Jobs, it was Tim Cook. With Bill Gates, it was Steve Ballmer. With Mark Zuckerberg, it was Sheryl Sandberg. They provide the business backup. They're very much the kind of the consigliere who comes in and actually gets stuff done, while the CEO is focusing on innovation and kind of the outward facing presentation
Mm.
element, being the face of the company, if you like. It's the COO who's behind the scenes, managing partner relationships, looking at commercial deals, making sure those business relationships are solid and productive, while the CEO is focused on the tech stack.
They are the Commander Riker to the CEOs, Jean-Luc Picard.
Exactly. Exactly.
We all need a Riker in our life.
We
Um,
absolutely do.
but Star Wars aside, you made some interesting points there, which is Tim Cook was Steve Jobs' right hand man, and Steve Ballmer was Bill Gates' right hand man. Now, you may also be familiar with these characters as Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, and Steve Ballmer, formerly CEO of Microsoft.
Mhm.
So, I mean, does this mean that we're going to eventually, some way down the line, have Sheryl Sandberg, CEO of Facebook?
I would say yes if I thought that Facebook could be pried from Mark Zuckerberg's hands. I suspect Sandberg will have to take it literally over his dead body. Um, but
I'm sure he'd figure out some way of achieving singularity and keeping control of it.
who knows? That's probably what all Facebook's AI research has been going towards. But yes, I think Sandberg is, should Zuckerberg ever decide to step down, Sandberg is far and away the logical choice for a new CEO.
I mean, when this happens, when you get the business person who becomes the CEO after the technical person, you know, leaves under whatever circumstances, are they, I guess, the perfect fusion of the business side and the technical side? Because they've been running the business side for so long. Because with all of them, they were there for a very long time before going CEO,
Hmm.
or not in the case of Sheryl Sandberg. But they have also been so long that they will have got a grip of the technical side as well. Or, I mean, Sandberg is a bit different because Bulmer and Kirk both already had a technical background, I believe.
Yes.
Whereas to the best of my knowledge, Sandberg doesn't.
Mm. It's it's tricky because logically speaking, by the time an organization reaches that kind of size, you shouldn't need the leader to have a technical background in theory.
Mm,
You should have a large and talented organization of developers, engineers, product specialists, UX specialists, so on and so forth. You should have a really robust, you know, tech organization fueling growth. So, you know, in theory, it shouldn't matter if the CEO only has the business side, but it always does.
yeah, you're right, actually, and, there have been some standout examples of business people being very much not a safe pair of hands that they were perhaps thought to be,
Mm.
such as, Leo Apotheker, of formerly of HP, infamously of HP, perhaps, although it was another business person who was brought in to right the ship, Meg Whitman, whose background is economics and just solid business.
Mm.
But now, once again, they have reverted to a technical head in Antonio Neri, who started off as a tech support, like level one, and
Mm.
like, it's one of those like he's a company man, and going at entry level, and you too can become the CEO.
Mm.
One of the people who actually managed to do that.
Yeah, it's a weirdly inspiring story, kind of rags to riches, as it were. But it's a really good example of why technical leadership is more important than you would maybe think for
Mm.
Silicon Valley companies throughout their life cycle, even when they reach the stage of, massive multinational corporations. But the flip side of this kind of real focus on technical leadership is that Silicon Valley CEOs, they need to have more people skills than you would initially think. The image of Silicon Valley in general, and Silicon Valley leaders in particular, is kind of quite aloof, quite detached, not particularly great with people, much more comfortable in the trenches coding than interacting with the rank and file staff.
Mm.
But that's not really that accurate, actually, because you kind of need those soft skills in order to make it anywhere in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, and I think, while we can think about how harsh CEOs, Silicon Valley CEOs can be on their staff and like what a reputation they have for that, um, people aren't going to follow you if you just go around being horrible to them and
Mm,
being a tyrant. So you have to have some element of charisma, some element of being able to inspire and motivate people as well. And all of that is people skills. Yeah, if you,
mm,
I don't know about you, I saw something yesterday about kind of what's the longest you stayed in a job. Mine was a single shift at a pub restaurant, like one. So yeah, a good couple of hours because the person I was working for was just the worst, and it was
mm,
a bad working environment. And I should have listened to the people who left. And it's going to be the same for any job, including Silicon Valley. So even if you are a hard ass, then you still have to have something else about you, and yeah, be able to rally the troops if you like.
mm. And again, I think that's where a strong COO particularly comes in because they
Mm,
can be that kind of hard taskmaster in some cases where you can be a bit less dictatorial with the
mm,
staff and have your kind of COO or second in command or whoever being the real hard taskmaster. But also beyond kind of staff retention and staff interaction, you need good people skills because if you're a Silicon Valley company, odds on you're VC funded. Your money comes from venture capital and from investors, and you can't get that money without being good at talking to venture capitalists and being good at pitching and, making your case and
mm.
convincing investors that it's your company that they should give money to rather than the countless others that pop up like weeds in the valley.
Yeah, yeah, if you turn up and you act entitled, then well, I think all of us have caught at least one episode of Dragon's Den, and and there's always somebody on there who turns up and is like, "Give me the money that you owe me because I said so in my head." And they're not the ones who get the money. Spoilers alert.
Mm,
And yeah, it strikes me as a similar situation. If you can't be personable and persuasive, then
mm.
you know it's not going to work out for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Like being a Silicon Valley CEO, for the first chunk of your company's lifespan, your entire job is selling yourself, selling your company, selling, in a lot of cases, the idea of what you're trying to do, because, a huge part of Silicon Valley business culture is about doing stuff that's never been done, new product categories,
Mm.
new applications, new services, stuff that doesn't have a proven track record. So you need to be able to go, no, this is the next big thing, and here's why.
Yeah, and I think that hits on to something else that's really important, which is Silicon Valley CEOs seem to, perhaps more than elsewhere, just have this idea of like vision. I think is probably the way that you like it's best described. That
Mm,
they can see 5 steps ahead. They can see where their business will be, and that's not this is not unusual in just all leaders, but this, like you say, is very kind of product, like consumer product, often focus. So the classic is Steve Jobs saying,
mm,
"Give people what they don't know that they need."
mm,
That's what you provide to them, and that is kind of how it has to be. There has to be that element of, I think, like a mash of technical understanding, leadership, and definitely creativity. And I think
mm,
creativity is probably like the secret ingredient in making a Silicon Valley CEO is you have to have somebody who can think creatively, abstractly, that kind of thing, which
mm.
you may not in certain other sectors.
Yeah, absolutely. You need that creativity to get beyond the stage of, to paraphrase the famous Henry Ford quote, to get beyond the stage of just giving people a faster horse.
Mm,
And if you don't have that as a Silicon Valley CEO, then bring that in,
yeah, yeah,
and the ability to identify the elements that you as an individual lack, and to bring that in through strategic hiring is a crucial element that can really make up for a number of kind of personal deficiencies skill wise in
yeah,
a Silicon Valley CEO. You don't have to be able to do everything, but you need to be able to identify what needs to be done and bring people in to do that. And then, do all the other things we've talked about, inspiring them, carrying that team through setbacks and failures and rejections and all of that kind of stuff. But you need to have that big picture thinking to go, I've got a couple of world class coders working for me. I've got someone with good, business connections and good business intuition who can go out and get me deals, but I need the creativity that's really going to be the heart of my product design and
mm,
product iteration.
yeah. Well, I must say, Adam, this has been all very upbeat, so I can't wait for next week when we're going to talk about all the worst aspects of Silicon Valley CEOs.
And there are many.
Hmm.
It's not all going to be negative, though. We're also going to be talking about what business leaders can learn from their Silicon Valley counterparts.
And if you want to be sure that you're not going to miss our second episode on Silicon Valley CEOs, you can subscribe to the IT Pro podcast wherever you listen if you haven't already. You can also find links to everything we've spoken about today in the show notes and even more on our website, www.itpro.co.uk.
You can also follow us on social media, as well as getting in touch with us at podcast@itpro.co.uk. The IT Pro podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.